They hid my shoes before church, laughing, "She won't go." I walked in with the pastor. That's how it begins in my mind. Even now, even after everything. The laughter. Not cruel, not loud, but casual. The kind that slides under your skin and settles there, reminding you you're not part of the moment, that you're the joke. That day, I stood in my own bedroom, holding onto the edge of the dresser to steady myself, barefoot and confused, wondering if I'd misplaced them again. My shoes, my black leather flats with the small silver buckles, the ones I wore every Sunday for nearly 20 years, polished carefully on Saturday evenings. I knew exactly where I'd left them. By the door, beneath the low bench, next to the little bottle of hand lotion I always forgot to use. But they weren't there. And from the living room, I heard the voice of my daughter's husband, light and amused, say, "Well, she won't go now." Then, laughter, and my granddaughter's voice joining in. That's the part that stung. Not just that they hid them, but that they thought it was funny, that they saw me, standing there, in that house where I was supposedly recovering, supposedly being looked after, not as a person preparing for church, but as a child, a burden, a puzzle to be managed. Like I'd become part of the furniture, one of those old lamps they didn't have the heart to throw away, but didn't quite know where to place either. I heard my daughter's voice after that, low and clipped, saying something I couldn't make out. But I heard the word tired, not in reference to herself, about me. "She gets so tired," she said, like I wasn't 2 rooms away, like I didn't still possess ears, pride, memory. That morning, I sat back down on the bed slowly and looked at my hands, still steady, still capable, and thought, is this what the rest of it is going to be? Let me back up, though not too far. I'm 81. My name is Ruth, though only a handful of people use it anymore. Most say mom or grandma, and some, like my son-in-law, say her or your mother, as if I'm a category, not a person. I live above a thrift store now, in a small apartment that smells of cinnamon and floor polish. The windows are narrow, but I can see the top of the church from the corner if I lean out far enough. I like it here. There's a quiet to it, a kind of dignity I hadn't felt in years. I come and go as I please. I hang my own laundry. I make my own tea, strong and slightly bitter, just the way I like it. But back then, I was living with my daughter, Eleanor, and her family. Temporarily, they said. I'd had a fall. Nothing serious. Just one of those slips on the kitchen tile that leaves you sore for weeks and nervous for months. They said I shouldn't be alone while I healed, that I'd be more comfortable with them, that it was just for a while. So I packed a small suitcase, brought my knitting bag and 2 of my favorite books, and stepped into their guest room like someone checking into a long, indefinite wait. I didn't argue. You don't argue when you're offered help, not when you've spent your life being the helper. You say thank you. You try not to need too much. You tell yourself it's temporary. At first, it was fine. I helped with the dishes, folded laundry, read stories to my youngest granddaughter, Elise, who liked to sit very still when I brushed her hair. Eleanor said I was a blessing. She kissed my cheek. But slowly, gently, almost invisibly, I began to shrink. It started with practical things. My room got colder when the thermostat was changed to save heating costs. The shelf where I kept my tea was cleared for more kid-friendly snacks. My chair by the window was quietly replaced with a more modern one that didn't support my back the same way. I adapted. You do, when you're not the one in charge. But then came the things that weren't about objects, the things about place. My daughter stopped asking if I wanted to come to the store with her. My son-in-law turned the radio down when I entered the room. My opinion was no longer sought, just endured, and church, my one ritual, my one insistence, became a point of tension. At first, they said they'd take me. Then they said the kids had sports practice. Then the car wasn't available. I started walking the 4 blocks when weather allowed. I didn't mind. I liked the air. But I began to notice that no one asked if I'd gotten there. No one asked how the sermon was. They didn't forget. They just stopped seeing it as something I do, and more as something I clung to, like a habit they hoped I'd grow out of. And then came that morning. That humiliating, quietly monstrous little morning when I reached for my shoes and found nothing. When I heard them laughing. When I realized, fully and without any remaining illusion, that I was being managed, that I had become, in their eyes, a responsibility to be mitigated, not a person to be honored. And the worst part wasn't the cruelty. It was the smallness of it, the ease with which they did it. No arguments, no explosions, just laughter and locked shoes. A line had been drawn in dust, not stone, but I saw it clearly. And yet, I went. Of course I went. I called the pastor from the landline in the hallway. I hadn't spoken to him in weeks. He answered on the second ring. I told him the truth. Not all of it, just enough. I said I couldn't find my shoes. I said I didn't want to miss service. I said I'd understand if he was too busy. He said he'd be there in 10 minutes. I borrowed a pair of flats from Margaret, the neighbor across the street, who had a bunion and a deep sense of fairness. They were too big. I stuffed tissues in the toes, and when he pulled up in that old silver sedan, I walked down the driveway slowly, back straight, eyes forward. I didn't look at the windows. I didn't wait for anyone to stop me. I opened the car door, got in, and said, "Let's go." He didn't ask questions, just drove. When I walked into that sanctuary, the first head that turned was Marian Lively's, who hadn't missed a service in 40 years and prided herself on knowing everything. Her eyebrows lifted. She didn't say a word, just made room for me in the pew. I sat. I sang. I bowed my head when it was time. I did not cry. And when the service ended and the pastor offered his arm to walk me to the car, I took it. That was the beginning. That was when I knew I would not die in that house. I would not be erased quietly by people who smiled in front of others but hid my shoes behind closed doors. I would not disappear. I am Ruth. I am 81, and I walked into church with the pastor, wearing borrowed shoes and a dignity no one could take. The next morning, Eleanor didn't speak to me. Not in the usual way, at least. She asked if I wanted cereal, but her voice had a new tone. Flat, clipped, the sound of someone offering something to keep the peace, not out of care. Her eyes didn't meet mine. Her husband, Richard, was already gone when I came into the kitchen. The girls sat quietly at the counter, not looking at me, their little feet swinging above the tiled floor, the same floor I had mopped 3 weeks prior when Eleanor said the cleaning woman kept rescheduling. I didn't bring up the shoes. I didn't ask why. I buttered my toast slowly and drank my coffee, lukewarm and weak. I dressed, folded my nightgown, and made my bed. I sat for a long time in the guest room that morning, hands folded in my lap, listening to the creaks and coughs of a house that no longer felt like shelter. By mid-afternoon, Eleanor appeared at the door. She didn't knock. She never knocked. "I made you an appointment with Dr. Levinson," she said. "He specializes in geriatric cognitive care. He's excellent." I looked up from the book I wasn't reading. "Cognitive care?" I asked, and she nodded with the kind of false sympathy people wear when they believe they are being gracious. "You've been having little lapses, forgetting things, misplacing items. The other day, you thought your shoes had disappeared." "They had disappeared," I said, but my voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Truth doesn't shout. It just waits. I left them by the door, where I always do. "Mom," she said softly, as if gentleness would make it less condescending. There are no bad guys here. We're just trying to help you. It's been a lot on all of us. You're getting older. That's okay. I wanted to laugh. Not because it was funny, but because of the absurdity of it. How quickly the world shifts beneath you. How swiftly help becomes control. How love gets translated into authority. I looked at her carefully, not with anger, but with the kind of clarity that only comes when someone you raised begins speaking to you like a patient. She looked tired, maybe even sincere, but I also saw the calculation behind her words, the appointment, the language, geriatric cognitive care. This wasn't concern. This was a slow erasure. This was a plan being enacted. I went to the appointment. I dressed carefully, pressed my blouse, combed my hair into a tidy bun. I brought my own medical history in a folder, typed and printed. When the doctor asked how I was feeling, I answered plainly, clearly, completely. I passed every memory test. I counted backward from 100 by sevens. I recalled a list of 5 words 3 times in a row. I remembered the nurse's name. "You're sharper than I am," the doctor joked, smiling. I smiled back, but not because I was amused, because I understood now. They wanted me incompetent. They needed it to justify the next step. When we returned home, Eleanor didn't ask how it went. I told her anyway. He says I'm fine. Cognitive function excellent. No signs of decline. She smiled without showing teeth. That's great, Mom. And then she left the room. That night, I found my shoes. In the bottom of a box in the garage, beneath a pile of winter scarves and an old booster seat that hadn't been used in years. Carefully hidden, deliberately tucked away. Dust on the soles, creased where they'd been folded. That was when I stopped wondering if I was imagining things. That was when I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. I carried the shoes back inside, cleaned them slowly, and placed them by the door again. That Sunday, I put them on and left before anyone else was awake. I walked to church without waiting for the pastor. I didn't need a ride. I needed to prove to myself that I still had legs worth using, direction worth choosing, and faith worth showing up for. When I returned, the door was locked. I didn't have a key. I knocked calmly. It was Elise who opened it. She blinked in surprise. "Grandma, you're back." I nodded. She stood aside. Richard came into the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "Where were you?" he asked. Not like a husband asking a wife, or a father asking a child, but like a man asking an employee who'd abandoned a shift. "Church," I said, "where I go every Sunday." He nodded slowly, then shrugged. "We just didn't know you'd left." I walked past him without a word. There was no point in responding to lies performed as confusion. Later that evening, Eleanor came to my room. She didn't knock. She never knocked. "We're all trying really hard," she said. "This isn't easy for us either." I looked at her, this woman I had raised, this child who once clung to my skirt during thunderstorms, this daughter who used to bring me dandelions in plastic cups and call them roses. "Is it really that hard," I asked, "to respect someone you claim to love?" She didn't answer. She just left the room, her face a mask of composure, but her fingers twitching. That was the moment I understood the truth. Not just in theory, but in bone. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't even family. I was a problem they didn't know how to solve. I was a presence they no longer wanted to accommodate. The fall I had suffered months ago, the one that brought me here, hadn't broken my bones, but it had cracked something else, something deeper. And now they saw the fracture and decided to widen it. This wasn't care. It was containment. This wasn't concern. It was possession. and I was done pretending otherwise. After that day, something shifted, not just between us, but inside the walls of that house. There was no confrontation, no argument, no raised voices or slammed doors. That would have required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was dangerous. They preferred subtler methods, and so the air changed. Slightly. Enough for me to notice. The silences stretched longer. The small talk grew more hollow. My chair at the dinner table was no longer automatically set. Some nights I found it pulled slightly aside. A small omission easily played off as forgetfulness. No one asked how church had been. No one asked if I wanted tea. These were not acts of cruelty in the traditional sense. No bruises, no insults, only withdrawal, only absence. The kind of slow, systematic removal of space that makes a person feel like they're taking up too much of it. I tried for a time to re-enter their world gently. I offered to pick up Elise from her after-school program when Eleanor's schedule grew crowded. She thanked me, but said it was all handled. I asked if Richard needed help with the garage cleanup he kept postponing. He blinked and said, "It's really better if I just get it done." Even when I offered to do the laundry, something I'd done most of my adult life, Eleanor said, "We've got a system now." And that word, system, lodged somewhere between my ribs like a shard. I began to realize they had created a life that no longer needed me. More than that, they preferred it that way. Mail started going missing. At first, I thought I'd misplaced it. Credit card statements, an old friend's birthday card. But one afternoon, I saw Eleanor sliding an envelope into her handbag before I entered the room. When she noticed me, she said it was a bill for Elise's music lessons, something I wouldn't understand. I didn't challenge her. I just nodded. But that evening, I went through the trash under the kitchen sink and found a torn letter addressed to me, from the Social Security office. Not urgent, not private, just mine, discarded without a word. Then there was the phone charger, a small thing really, but important. I kept it by my bedside, always plugged into the same socket, always wrapped neatly when not in use. One night it was gone. Elise claimed she'd borrowed it, but I found it 2 days later behind the washing machine, bent at the neck, useless. I said nothing. That was the new pattern. Silence in place of justice, observation in place of confrontation. I began to mark these moments quietly to myself, a mental tally that grew heavier with each day. They never said they wanted me gone, but they no longer spoke to me the way people speak to someone with a future. I was referred to in the third person more and more. She's already eaten. She likes her tea weak. She naps in the afternoon, as if I were a pet whose routines needed explanation. Even Elise, once my shadow in the garden, began to pull away. I don't blame her. Children mirror what they see, and what she saw was a woman shrinking into silence. One evening, I tried to teach her a song my grandmother had taught me, a little lullaby in Yiddish. She looked at me with a polite smile and said, "We don't really do old songs anymore, Grandma." I nodded. Of course not. I stopped trying after that. The days became long stretches of managed invisibility. I cleaned the guest room thoroughly, just to keep myself moving. I repotted Eleanor's orchids when they began to wilt, though she never thanked me. I knitted scarves no one asked for. I watched baking shows on mute. I began to wake before dawn, not because I needed to, but because sleep felt like avoidance. I would sit in the kitchen in the early dark, watching the coffee maker slowly drip, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the low rustle of a house that didn't know what to do with me. One morning, I overheard Eleanor on the phone, talking to someone, her sister perhaps. She was in the laundry room, the door cracked just enough. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I was looking for my cardigan, the thick blue one that kept vanishing and reappearing like a bad memory. "No, she's not causing trouble," Eleanor said, her voice low. "But it's just, exhausting. She's always around, always in the middle of things. She has opinions about everything. Like yesterday, she told Elise not to microwave her oatmeal, said it loses its soul. I mean, what does that even mean? It's oatmeal. A pause, then laughter. Quiet, conspiratorial laughter. The kind you share with someone who already agrees with you. We just need space, she said finally. She doesn't get that. It's not the same anymore. I stood outside the door for a long time. My cardigan was hanging right there, on the banister, where I had left it. I took it, wrapped it around my shoulders, and went outside, barefoot on the cold concrete, just to feel something sharp, something real. I sat on the back steps, staring at the garden bed I'd helped dig last spring. The mint was overgrown. The rosemary patch had dried out. No one tended it anymore. The earth, like me, had been forgotten. It was around this time that they started locking the front door during the day. Subtly at first, with the explanation that there'd been car break-ins in the neighborhood. Then it became routine. If I left for a walk, I had to call to be let back in. If I went to the market, I had to wait on the porch until someone heard the bell. I asked once for a key of my own. Eleanor said she'd look into it. She never did. I never asked again. These were not accidents. These were decisions. I could feel it in the way Richard barely looked up from his phone when I entered a room, in the way Elise's bedroom door remained shut, in the way Eleanor smiled just a little too tightly when I asked if I could bake something. We're watching our carbs right now, she said. So I baked nothing. One day, I opened the hallway closet to find my coat missing. Not the big winter one. I rarely wore that anymore, but my everyday gray one. The one with the soft lining and the inside pocket where I kept a $10 bill just in case. I searched everywhere, asked Eleanor. She looked up from her laptop and said, "Did you check your room?" It was not in my room. It was not anywhere. A week later, I saw it in the back of the car, folded on top of a pile of donation bags. It was going to Goodwill. Like I was. When I mentioned it, she smiled and said, "Oh, I didn't realize. I thought it was one of the extras." I nodded. Of course, an extra. Even the language began to betray me. I was no longer introduced to her friends as my mother, but this is Ruth. She's staying with us. Like a guest, like a visitor, like a question mark. And still, I remained. Because I didn't yet know where else to go. Because I believed, foolishly, that dignity was something you could hold on to through patience. Because I kept hoping that if I was kind enough, quiet enough, useful enough, they might remember who I was. Not just the woman they now housed, but the woman who raised Eleanor through winters without heat, who worked double shifts and made soup from scraps, and always remembered birthdays. The woman who buried her husband alone because her daughter couldn't get time off work. The woman who gave everything and asked for very little. But they didn't remember, or they chose not to. And so I began to fade in earnest, not from age or illness, but from the soft, suffocating cruelty of being no longer needed and no longer seen. I don't know what made me take out the old address book that afternoon. Maybe it was the quiet. The kind that sits in the corners of rooms, not peaceful but stagnant, like stale air you can't open a window against. I hadn't touched it in years, maybe since Derek died. It was cloth-bound, dark green, a birthday gift from someone I couldn't remember. The pages had yellowed slightly, the ink on some entries smudged. I flipped through slowly, as if the pages might start speaking. Most of the names had been crossed out, moved, passed away, faded into the folds of time and distance. But on page 43, under P, I saw it. Pastor Leland, home, written in my own hand, neat and precise. I hadn't spoken to him since I'd moved into Eleanor's house. I hadn't wanted to be a burden. But that day, I picked up the phone and dialed. He answered after 3 rings. His voice was warm, unchanged, and slightly surprised. "Ruth," he said, drawing out the name like a coat he hadn't worn in a while. "I was just thinking about you the other day." "How are you?" I paused. It wasn't a question I could answer quickly. "I'm managing," I said. Then I added, "I think I need to see you." There was a silence, short but full. "Of course," he said. "I'll be by at 10 tomorrow. I'll bring coffee." The good kind he arrived right on time, holding 2 cups and a paper bag with scones that crumbled beautifully between the fingers. We sat on the back porch. Eleanor had taken Elise to gymnastics, Richard was at work, and the house was quiet. I told him things. Not everything. Not the shoes, not the coat in the donation bag, but enough. Enough to name what was happening without having to relive every insult. I spoke slowly, like I was trying to convince myself the words mattered. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty comforts or tell me to be patient. When I finished, he looked out at the overgrown mint patch and said, "Sometimes, it's not about whether they love you. It's about whether they know how to see you. And sometimes they don't want to." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were off, the windows throwing back my reflection. I saw an old woman in a loose sweater, hands folded, lips tight, but I also saw something else. A flicker, a sharpness, a trace of the woman I used to be. The one who used to laugh too loud at PTA meetings and bake 6 pies for Thanksgiving just because she could. The one who drove cross-country alone at 53 and stayed in a motel that smelled like bleach and boldness. She was still in there, and she didn't want to be buried before her time. The next day, I called the pastor again. "I want to come back to service," I said. "Every Sunday. I'll find a way there." He didn't ask why. He didn't mention Eleanor. He just said, "Then I'll pick you up." No fuss. That Sunday, I put on a skirt that hadn't seen sunlight in years. I brushed my hair with care. My shoes were worn but clean. I left the house before anyone else was awake, locking the door behind me. The air was cool, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the rhythm of my own body, slow but sure, moving because it wanted to, not because it was told to. We arrived just as the bells began. The sanctuary smelled like old wood and lilies. Marian Lively raised her eyebrows again. I took my place in the 3rd pew and sang with a voice that cracked only slightly. Afterward, a woman named Carol offered me a ride next week if needed. I thanked her. On the way home, the pastor asked if I'd ever considered applying for housing through the church. "We have a few seniors upstairs from the thrift shop," he said. "Private entrance. Not fancy, but it's quiet. Safe." "Yours," I said. "I'd think about it." He nodded like a man who understood the long game of healing. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with the church bulletin still in my purse. I read every announcement slowly. Potluck dates, volunteer shifts, Bible study times. Then I opened the desk drawer and found an old envelope with my name on it, one I'd never opened. Inside was a letter from Derek, dated 3 months before he died. His handwriting shaky, but unmistakably his. "Ruth," it began, "you've always carried more than you were meant to. Someday when it's too much, I hope you remember that you're allowed to set it down." I read it 3 times, then folded it back and placed it in my coat pocket. That was the moment something opened. 2 days later, I walked 3 blocks to the post office and asked about a change of address form. The woman behind the counter gave me a pen and a gentle look. "Big move?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. I filled it out, slowly, carefully, each letter a quiet rebellion. I didn't submit it. Not yet. But I held the form all the way home. It wasn't immediate. These things never are. When people sense control slipping, they don't react with honesty. They tighten their grip quietly, behind the language of concern. A week passed after I began attending church again, and no one said a word about it. Not Eleanor, not Richard, not even Elise, though she gave me a strange look when she saw me ironing my blouse before sunrise. I expected coldness, maybe sarcasm, but what came was worse. Studied indifference. I came and went like a tenant whose rent was overdue. They didn't ask where I'd been. They didn't ask how I got there. It was as if the very act of noticing me would give me power. So they chose not to see me at all, until the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Eleanor brought in the mail with her usual clatter of keys and grocery bags. She tossed the envelopes on the counter and left them there. I waited until she'd gone upstairs, then looked through the stack. One envelope was addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in over a year. I knew it instantly. Kieran, my grandson, my favorite. The only one who ever called just to talk. The only one who used to sit beside me on the porch without asking for anything. He must have gotten the address from the church directory. Or maybe he remembered it from one of the Christmas cards I used to send before they began going unopened. I opened the letter slowly, not wanting to tear the paper. Just his name on the return address made my fingers tremble. Inside were only a few lines. Grandma, I heard you've been going to St. Agnes again. I've been checking the bulletin online. I miss you. No one will say where you are, but I wanted you to know that I see you. I always did. If you ever want to talk, here's my new number. I love you. Kieran. There was no drama in it, no questions, just presence, recognition, and something in me, something rigid and scared and long-starved, softened. I folded the letter neatly and tucked it into my book of Psalms, between the pages marked Deliverance and Rescue. I didn't call him. Not yet, but I traced his name with my finger, over and over, like a blessing. That night, at dinner, I spoke. I got a letter from Kieran today, I said calmly, passing the salad bowl to Eleanor. She blinked, then said nothing. Richard didn't look up from his plate. Elise frowned. Kieran? She asked. From New York? I nodded. He asked about me. Wondered where I was. Said he missed me. Eleanor wiped her mouth with her napkin and smiled that tight, glassy smile she'd perfected. That's sweet, she said. He's always been sentimental. Richard snorted softly. I saw it for what it was. A warning. Mention him again, and you make things harder. I finished my meal in silence. The next Sunday, Pastor Leland didn't just drop me off. He parked and walked in with me. We sat together in the second pew. After service, he introduced me to a woman named Myra who ran the thrift store housing ministry. She shook my hand firmly and said, "We've got one unit left upstairs. Clean, modest. Rent's sliding scale. You'd qualify." She didn't pressure me. She just handed me a flyer with her number on it. That night, I read it 3 times by lamplight. Rent, $320 a month. Utilities included. No stairs. Private entrance. Safe. Quiet. The words sat like warm stones in my chest. 3 days later, I found the courage to ask Eleanor directly. I'd like to move out, I said. I think I've found a place. It's quiet and close by. I can still see Elise on weekends if she wants, but I think it's time I had my own key again. I spoke gently. I gave her every chance to feel unthreatened, but she didn't take it. Her face froze, and she laughed once, sharply. "You've been talking to that pastor too much," she said. "This is ridiculous. You're not well. You shouldn't be making decisions like this." "I'm perfectly well," I replied. "Dr. Levinson confirmed that, didn't he?" She stood, pacing the kitchen. "Mom, you don't understand what you're doing. That place is for people who don't have families. You have a family." I looked at her then. Really looked. Do I? The next day she called Pastor Leland. "I know because I heard her in the laundry room. I'm worried about my mother," she said, in the same performative whisper she used when talking to Elise's school. "She's been acting erratically. She left the house without telling anyone. She's making plans to move out. I'm not sure she's safe on her own anymore." That Sunday, he picked me up as usual, but his voice was quieter. "I got a call," he said. "I'm not questioning you, Ruth. But I have to ask, are you sure this is what you want?" I turned to him. "Pastor, do you believe in deliverance?" He smiled softly. "I do." "Then believe this. I'm walking myself out of a house where I became invisible." He nodded. That was enough. The day after that, a man in a crisp suit knocked on the door. He was polite, overly so, and introduced himself as a family law mediator. "Your daughter asked me to speak with you," he said. "She's concerned. There's talk of establishing a power of attorney, just to ensure your affairs are in order. Nothing dramatic, just precaution." I smiled the way women do when they're preparing a gunshot. "I've been managing my affairs longer than you've been alive," I said. "Tell my daughter if she wants control over a person, she should buy a television." He looked startled. "Good." That night, I called Myra. "I'd like to see the apartment," I said. She met me the next morning. The walk up the narrow back stairwell was lined with peeling paint and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and mothballs. The apartment was small. One room, kitchenette, bathroom with a high-seat toilet, but it had a window that faced east, and a hook where I could hang my coat, and just enough room for a chair by the window. I stood in the middle of it and breathed in, and for the first time in years, the air felt mine. "I'll take it," I said. "Do you have a deposit?" she asked gently. I pulled out the envelope I'd hidden in the back of my sock drawer. $560. Saved over a year from birthday checks. Grocery reimbursements I'd never spent. Little unspoken sacrifices. It was enough. That evening, I began packing. Not everything. Just what mattered. My coat, my church shoes, the green address book, my Psalms, the photo of Kieran as a baby, the old recipe box, and one clean mug. I left the rest. You only take what you want to carry into your new life. I waited until Eleanor was at a school board meeting. Richard was watching the game. Elise was upstairs. I placed a note on the kitchen table. "Eleanor, thank you for your hospitality. I'm not angry. I'm not confused. I'm simply ready to be seen again. Please don't come find me. If Elise wants to visit, she knows how to find the church." "Mom." Then I walked out the door and didn't look back. The pastor met me with a borrowed van. We drove in silence. When we arrived, Myra handed me the keys. No speech, no fuss. Just a set of keys on a simple metal ring. My apartment smelled like old wood and possibility. I hung up my coat. I placed the photo on the windowsill. I sat in the chair by the window, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I let myself weep. Not for the loss, for the return. The first night in the new apartment was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. Not the forced silence of being ignored or the sterile hush of a house built on control, but real silence. Honest, uncurated. I heard the creak of the radiator, the occasional groan of the pipes, the distant thrum of a delivery truck. Each sound reminded me that I was finally somewhere of my own, a space that didn't monitor or manage me. I sat on the narrow bed without unpacking, just breathing. My body felt like it had exhaled for the first time in months. I made tea on the small electric kettle Myra had loaned me and drank it standing by the window, watching the early evening light settle onto the sidewalk. No one called. No one knocked. And for once, I didn't interpret that as abandonment. It was peace. The next morning, I woke before the sun. Not out of anxiety, but habit. The long-trained rhythm of a woman who'd risen early for decades. I made coffee with the same spoon I'd used for 20 years, the one I'd packed from Eleanor's house without guilt. I opened my Psalms and read Kieran's letter again. His words still felt like a thread of light pulled through the darkness. I didn't call him. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the softness that came with love. I needed to finish something first. I needed to make sure I'd fully stepped out of the role I'd been pressed into for too long. A role that required smallness, silence, and sacrifice disguised as grace. 2 days later, Eleanor showed up. Not at the door. At the church. I saw her before she saw me. She stood stiffly at the back of the sanctuary, wearing a coat too clean for rain and an expression too composed for real worry. I turned my face forward and didn't flinch when the pastor began the sermon. I sang louder than I had the week before. After the benediction, I turned to leave, and she stepped into my path, eyes wide with false relief. "Mom," she said, "thank God." "We've been worried sick," I didn't respond. "You can't just disappear like that," she continued. "Do you know how irresponsible that was?" Elise was crying. Richard couldn't sleep. I called the police. I raised an eyebrow. "And what did they say?" "That you're an adult," she snapped, "and that, unless there's a crime, there's nothing they can do. They asked if you had dementia." I didn't know what to say. "You could have said I was tired of living like I didn't matter," I said quietly. "But I'm sure that didn't occur to you." Her voice dropped to a hiss. "What is this? A performance? Living over a thrift store like some martyr? Do you think this proves something?" I looked at her, this daughter I once fed from my own plate, and said, "It proves I remember who I am." She blinked, the mask slipping just slightly, and before she could recover, I walked past her and out into the rain. Later that evening, I wrote a letter, not to her, but to a lawyer. I found the number on a flyer taped to the community center bulletin board. Senior legal aid. No nonsense. No cost. His name was Mr. Alvarez, and his voice on the phone was calm, dispassionate. I told him everything. Not with emotion, but with precision. The financial dependency they had tried to force. The misplaced documents. The attempts to isolate. The sudden concern when I began to act independently. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he said, "We can draft a statement. Something official. It won't stop them from contacting you, but it will stop them from pretending they have authority." We met 2 days later at the back of the thrift store. He brought papers and a small laptop. I signed my name 3 times. One of those signatures went on a notarized declaration that I was of sound mind, living independently, and not under duress. Another on a cease and desist notice. He told me he'd mail it directly to the Harlow family's residence. I didn't ask how he found the address. That wasn't my concern anymore. What mattered was this. I was no longer asking for space. I was claiming it. The next day, I received a delivery at the shop. It was a parcel wrapped too neatly, with no return address. Inside, a pair of shoes. My shoes, the black flats with silver buckles polished to a shine. There was no note, but I knew. Eleanor had found them again. Perhaps in the back of the closet, perhaps in the bottom of a bin she had meant to give away. Perhaps she'd known exactly where they were all along. I placed them carefully on the shelf by my door, not because I needed them. I had a new pair now, softer on my arches, but because they were mine. A part of me she hadn't been able to erase. A part of me she had hidden, but not destroyed. 3 days passed. Then a knock. I opened the door to find a man in a charcoal blazer and polished shoes, too formal for this neighborhood. He introduced himself as Derek Sorensen. I represent the Harlow family, he said. They're concerned about your well-being. I stared at him for a long moment before replying. Tell them I'm concerned too, I said. Concerned they think silence is consent. He cleared his throat. They'd like to explore options for reconciliation. There's been talk of a joint account, some medical oversight, just to ensure your safety. I smiled, not kindly. I already have oversight. It's called self-respect. He blinked. And I have a lawyer, I added. Any further contact will go through him. I believe you know the name? Mr. Alvarez? That silenced him. He nodded once and left without another word. That evening, I lit a candle, not for prayer, but for confirmation. I watched the flame flicker, small and steady, and whispered, "This is mine. My breath. My choice. My fire." Then I took out a pen and wrote a final letter, this time to Lisa. Not Eleanor. Lisa was the one who'd smirked when I asked where my shoes were. Lisa had laughed. Lisa had leaned in and said, "She won't go," as if she knew, as if I was done. I wrote exactly 3 lines. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. I finally started mine. I mailed it the next morning with a stamp that had a bird on it. A finch, the kind that sings even in winter. That afternoon, I made soup and sat on the windowsill, legs wrapped in a quilt. The sun was low. I opened Kieran's letter again. Then I picked up the phone and called. He answered on the first ring. "Grandma." "Yes," I said. "It's me." A pause. "You're okay." I closed my eyes and breathed in. "I'm more than okay," I said. "I'm free." I've been here for 7 months now. The thrift store below opens at 10 each morning, and I like to sit by the window with my coffee, watching the volunteers wheel racks of coats onto the sidewalk. Sometimes I help fold sweaters in the back room or sort donations into bins marked useful and unloved. I've become good friends with Myra, who runs the place like a quiet general, and with Carol from the church, who brings me day-old pastries and insists they're blessed leftovers. I never argue. I eat them with joy. I've hung 2 prints on the wall, flowers in a vase and a path through a birch forest. I bought them for $2 each, but they make the room feel finished. I even have a tiny cactus on the windowsill. It doesn't bloom often, but when it does, it's fierce. Elise visits twice a month. She comes alone now. Sometimes we bake together. Sometimes we don't speak much at all. We just sit, playing cards or listening to the ticking of the wall clock. She's taller than I remember. The first time she came, she brought me a bracelet she'd made. Small glass beads, awkwardly strung, but full of effort. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't need to. She was here. That was enough. Eleanor hasn't come. She sends occasional messages, neutral, practical things. Elise will be there at 4. "Did you get your flu shot?" I reply only when necessary. I don't wish her harm. I simply no longer belong to her version of family. I've stepped out of that narrative. I've taken back my voice from the soft silence she wrapped me in. There's no anger left, only distance, a border she helped build, but I now protect. Kieran calls weekly. We talk about everything: his apartment, his cat, the new girl he's seeing, my soup recipes, the sermon I heard last Sunday. He doesn't ask what happened in that house. I think he already knows. Some things don't need unpacking. They just need witnessing. He says he might visit in the spring. I've already cleared a space by the window for an extra chair. Last Sunday, during service, Pastor Leland gave a sermon on resilience. He said it wasn't about strength. Not really. Not about enduring pain with stoicism or burying wounds beneath composure. He said resilience was remembering your own name in a room full of people who tried to rename you. He said it was choosing stillness, not because you'd been told to sit down, but because you decided where to place your weight. I sat in the second pew and let the words find their place inside me. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. And breathing now feels like something sacred. Today I wore my plum-colored shoes to church, the ones I bought with my first check after moving out. They're not elegant, but they're mine. They carried me across the threshold of a life I chose. I walk a little slower these days, but I walk with purpose. And when I sit down in that pew, when the choir starts up and the sun pours through the stained glass, I think of all the steps I had to take to get here. Not one of them wasted, not one of them easy, but all of them mine. Sometimes I see other women at church, quiet ones, folded ones whose eyes dart quickly, as if checking how much room they're allowed to take up. And I want to say to them, not loudly, not urgently, but steadily, they were wrong about you. You're still here. That's not nothing. That's everything. I live upstairs now, above the second-hand coats and chipped teacups and old picture frames. And every morning, I look down at the street and remind myself, I was hidden once. Now, I am seen.